This Defeating Adventism is going to show that Ellen White is just simply the product of the events of her time. Now, I showed this book. Actually, I didn't even show the book because I didn't even have the book when I did the video on first video on Ellen White's family big Bible. I did show a copy of the book, and I showed one page from the book. The book is what? Victorian Women and the Theater of Trance. Now, I quoted from this book because I found in here a young girl, pretty close to Ellen's age, in 1855, who, through the control of her spirits, enabled her to lift heavy objects. Like Ellen White, who, through the control of her spirits, enabled her to lift heavy Bibles. Interesting. So anyway, I said, you know what? I'm going to buy this book. And I think I even said that in the video. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to read it. And if I find some things in here and it merits a video, I'll make a video. And if it doesn't, well, then it just falls by the wayside. It didn't fall by the wayside. The parallels detailed in this book of Victorian women, of which Ellen was one, that's the Queen Victoria, Victorian age, are astounding. Blew me away. The more I kept reading this book, I'm thinking, oh boy, video's coming. Here's my conclusion. I'll state it right up front. There's no difference between 19th century spiritualist and 19th century spiritualist Ellen White. And what they did, and what they said, and how they acted, no difference. I want you to recall in Defeating Adventism number 40, where Ellen White met her dead husband in a dream. You know, this is just another example in that video that I showed you where Ellen White is just the same as the women of her time. Now, a lot of things I'm going to quote from this book. Because again, I read the book and so anyway, the facts are largely coming from this book and this author. By the way, I wrote the author. And too bad she didn't write me back. Maybe I'll write her again. But I wrote her and I said, you know, did you come across Ellen White in your research for this book? Because she did everything that you talk about in here. She never wrote me back. What makes this book really, really interesting, and I didn't know it when I did the Ellen's Big Bible video, was that this woman who wrote this book is a department chair at a university in America in the theatrics department. So she comes to this topic with a complete background in performative arts, theater. And it's her assertion that these women of this time, Victorian women, were performing theater for all of us to see. So these Victorian women of this time started really a trance movement of mediums, not known before. So all this is happening in the time of Ellen White, and started by women. There are some men, but it's probably 95% women. Now, here's something we can't appreciate, and it's a point that she makes in this book over and over and over, that in Victorian times, a woman speaking publicly was breathtaking. It would stop men in their tracks and other women because it didn't happen, wasn't allowed. That was a societal norm. That was a line of the societal norm not to be crossed. But these women at this time were doing that and crossing that line. So this whole female trance movement largely it started becoming really popular around 1848. Now, that's just 4 years from 1844, right? So becoming a trance medium, here's what else it did. Breaking another societal norm of the time. It allowed these, again, like I said, remember I said they're females largely. It allowed these females, these women, to gain an income because they were traveling trance performers in a show. They sold tickets. You could go visit them. And that was another societal norm. A woman working like that outside the house, not exactly allowed. Now, here's something else that I found very interesting. Trance women were largely under the control of men. Interesting. Keep that in mind because that's going to be important later. Now, again, we cannot appreciate this. And she kept hammering this point over and over in this book, that publicly speaking women of this time period were such breakers of Victorian societal norms, it was virtually just almost unheard of. So that when a woman did this, it commanded an audience, and it got an audience. Trance mediums were extraordinarily popular, let's say from the 1840s into the early 1900s. This was so popular that this book right here was a bestseller in 1894. And this book here is dated from 1894. It's the book called Trilby. Now, she mentions Trilby in here. Now, I've had this book in my library for decades and didn't know why I had it. I just kept it. Now I know why I have it. Because in here, she mentions Trilby. And I thought, Trilby. I know that book. I know the title. Just don't know what it is. It's a novel. I stopped reading this book within probably the first 10 pages. Didn't even get out of the preface. Because she cited Trilby. And I said, I'm going to read Trilby first. Then I'm going back to the book. Well, I read Trilby here. And here's what I learned. Trilby is a story of she's a young girl. She's living in Paris. She becomes friends with three Englishmen who are living also in Paris, and they're all into art. Trilby's not, but she kind of hangs out and meets her English friends, and so during this time, one of the Englishmen is also very good. He's very accomplished pianist. And he was playing in the book, Trilby, he was playing on the piano, and they had Trilby sing, and they recorded what a horrible singer Trilby was. Absolutely horrible. So horrible you just want to leave the room horrible. Now, here's why this book was popular. Because it's popular because of what was going on at the time. Enter Svengali. Some of you may have heard that term before. Popularized in this book here, Trilby. Svengali comes in, takes control of Trilby, and all of a sudden Trilby can perform masterfully in the venues of Paris, and she can sing like a nobody's business. And she holds audiences are just falling, adoring this young woman, Trilby, who can sing. Who Trilby, by the way, doesn't know she's under the control of Svengali when she's doing this performative art. You know what? I read this book and I said, James and Ellen are simply modeling what was going on during their time. We got this very popular novel of Svengali controlling Trilby, and the whole trance performative mediums. James White is Ellen White's Svengali and controlling her. So, to see a woman, like I said, other than a professional actress, because there were professional actresses of the time. Even then, professional actresses were even sensational. And I'm going to give you an example of one of those. But a woman speaking in public commanded attention. And that's exactly what Ellen White did. She spoke in public. That got attention. That was a big, big deal that I still don't think that we and I can appreciate. So this book turned out to be full of examples of Victorian trance women who mesmerized men and it controlled men, persuaded men to do things I think that they probably never would have done. It's amazing some of the stories what these women did here. Sigmund Freud is just one example of an utterly spellbound man by the performance of an actress named Sarah Bernhardt. Sigmund Freud was so, for lack of a better term, mesmerized by Sarah Bernhardt, he gushed like a little schoolboy with his first little love crush. And again, see what I said? This is women performing on stage and speaking in public did things to men that we can't appreciate. Now, what she also talks about in this book is that this idea of women performing, and we can even say to a certain degree being deceptive, was not unique in this time period, and actually predates this time period by roughly 50 or 60 years. She cites Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who I I'm very familiar with because I had to read his social contract. But she cites Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1758 talking about women as being like manipulators and actors in the home, not so much on stage, but using their feelings and emotions and manipulations and actions in the home, and he calls the women, actually he calls them deceptive. Now, these traveling trance shows were virtually always, I mean, if not always, they were always led by a man. And the woman was always the trance object. There's the show. The woman is the trance object, and she's under the control of a man somewhere, somehow, in the background. And again, as the popular novel Trilby showed us. Let me give you the first example. Elizabeth O'Kee is her name. She was an experienced public speaker, by the way, because she came out of a heretical church in England by a guy named Edward Irving. And so she was used to performing in public because in Edward Irving's church in England, she would be blurting out, speaking in tongues. Much like you see in a Kenneth Copeland crusade video. By the way, more coming on Edward Irving. We're going to put that one on ice for now. Ellen White is no different than the trans antics of Elizabeth O'Kee. Matter of fact, Ellen grew up in an environment where religious fanaticism was commonplace. I want you to remember Defeating Adventism number 15 and the trial of Israel Damon. The newspaper account recording this event, hugging, kissing, laying on the floor, rolling around, and unmarried persons going into rooms by themselves? Absolutely scandalous. I also finished another reading of a book covering this period, and it's called The Burnt Over District. I'm going to show you a close-up picture of this later. This is by far the best book written covering this whole, the fanaticism of the very early 1800s all the way into probably the late 1800s. Burnt Over District, where Ellen lived in upstate New York. And again, this book is great. Here's my criticism of the book. This author here relies on Seventh-day Adventist historians in this book, who are not going to tell you the truth. And one inaccuracy in this book is the author citing Seventh-day Adventist historians talking about ascension robes, agreeing with the Seventh-day Adventist historians, saying there's just no account of ascension robes. Oh, really? Perhaps, too bad he wasn't still alive, I could say you could watch Defeating Adventism number 20, where I talk about the silly robes that the Adventists wore, and I got, 15 newspaper accounts? All across the United States of Adventists in their ascension robes? Sorry. Other than that, fantastic book. Full of detail, chock full of notes, sites, resources, highlights the fanaticism. In the Burned Over District of this time, there were displays, inappropriate, fanatical religious displays, coming from a lot of groups, and one of them is the Methodist. Ellen White, shouting Methodists. There's an account in here now of pastors. There's several accounts. I'm just going to cite one. 60 pastors from New York in 1825 want to have a meeting to discuss the evils of Methodism. So to say that in the Burnt Over District time that it was a wild time where nobody criticized it is inaccurate. And here's the reason why I read this book. There's one reason why I read it. That's because a couple of years ago I got this book. And it's called Accepting Ellen White, Early Seventh-day Adventist and the Gift of Prophecy Dilemma. Theodore Letervov? I don't know. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name. But when I read this book, and I hadn't read the Burnt Over District yet, I read this sentence in the book and knew this Adventist, like Adventists are wont to do, inaccurately cite history. They're either ignorant, lazy, or deceptive. You Adventists can choose which one. Here's what he said from this book, and I'm reading from page 11. American Christianity in the mid-1800s was open to both charismatic and visionary manifestations. Such experiences were not seen as something strange or extraordinary, but were viewed as a sign of God's power and acceptance. On the very first textual page of this book, after the preface, this author wants to make the argument that, well, everybody was just the spiritual movement of the time. But, well, I already cited to you from this book where he's wrong. No, they weren't. Yes, there was fanaticism, but no, there were Presbyterians, by the way, did not agree with all the fanaticism of the Methodists and others. So that's why Adventist authors and historians are not reliable, because he totally isn't reliable. I thought about doing a video on this, but anyway, I passed. So Ellen comes from a background of excess, just like Elizabeth O'Kee did in 1838. The trance experiences of Elizabeth O'Kee are just like the trance performances of Ellen White. There really is no difference. Let me continue here with another case from this book. 1845, playwright, trance performer, Anna Cora Mowat. And she said this: "The power of swaying the emotions of a crowd is one of the most thrilling sensations I ever experienced." Power and sway of emotions. Gee, do you think Ellen White ever felt that power and sway while in performative trance of swaying the emotions of others? Gee, I think so. It's no coincidence that Ellen White was a trance medium, because it was virtually on her doorstep. So look at this map here. Ellen White lived in Rochester, upstate New York, burnt over district. And look, she is just maybe a day's horse ride, a half-day horse ride from Palmyra. That's Joseph Smith. That's Mormonism. And that's walking distance from Palmyra to Hydesville, which is the famous Fox sisters and their spiritual wrappings. Look with me here at the burnt over district. Here's the actual book that I held up earlier. You can see copyright 1950. In this book were two maps. I want you to look at the map in the upper left-hand corner. That's just a point of reference. That's where Rochester is on the map. Now look at the map in the lower right-hand corner and spend your time looking at that. So you see where Rochester is? Look at all these dots. Let me read the map, what it says here on page 350. This map is what? Every dot is a spiritualist lecturer and medium that was known in 1859. Look at upstate New York in 1859. Absolutely dotted with this. Ellen White grew up with this completely all around her. Now it gets real interesting. Trance performers were in a sort of competition. There's only so much trance performance you can do before everybody goes, "Oh yeah, I've already seen it. We got this lady over here doing trance performance and this one over here doing trance performance. It's all the same thing." So you know what they did? Well, they had to up their game. They had to do something different. So trance performers suddenly started visiting other planets in their trance states. Let me give you some examples from the book here. In 1875, a Miss Ellen Ward, I didn't misquote that, Ellen Ward, she traveled to 3 planets, each with a distinct race and culture. On the 3rd planet she visited, she described the aliens as having large limbs and muscles, and they enjoyed a temperate climate, and they were vegetarians. Ella Grace is another one here. Visited alien life on tiny planets in 1895. Other trance performers she mentions in the book visit Mars, Venus, Jupiter. But then there is this one. This is David Dugard. Now I've got a trance performer, who's a male, so a little different. This is Hafed, Prince of Persia, from 1876. Here's the actual book. You're going to see a copy of that book. David Dugard was channeling Hafed, Prince of Persia. And this book I just held up that you see here are the spiritual communications of Hafed, Prince of Persia, as channeled by Mr. Dugard. And here's what he says on page 235. You can see in September of 1872, he goes, "I myself, in the course of my various missions in spirit life, visited some of these worlds, and I found that the intelligent beings living on them far excel in every way the inhabitants of Earth." Let's keep reading the next sentence. He says, "Many of those beings, having thrown off the material body, have been here too. They pass away from their bodies, not alas as you do on earth, but as in sleep, and that not until they're ready to go. There is no death in childhood of these races. All come to maturity, and then they pass away." Now I want you to focus on the last sentence, then we're going to flip the page to 236. "In the worlds I refer to, there is no transgression of God's law, and consequently no suffering, no pride bringing with it these direful results so frequently presented to you on earth. but all are under the loving sway of one great head, and all are subject to the great king who rules over all. You just read in Hafed, Prince of Persia, where spiritualist David Dugard visits other planets, talks to them, and they keep the laws of God. Does that sound familiar to you, Seventh-day Adventist or former Seventh-day Adventist? It should, because now we're going to look at Ellen White's early writings. Again, Ellen White is simply a woman of her time. So here we go. Early writings, same book I just held up, 1882. And what does Ellen say? Let's start at the top text with red. The Lord has given me a view of other worlds. Oh, gee, that's like that unique, right? Green text. The inhabitants of the places were all sizes, but they were noble, majestic, and lovely. Now the purple text. I asked one of them why they were so much more lovely than those on earth. Their reply was, we have lived in strict obedience to the commandments of God and have not fallen by disobedience like those on earth. Here's David Dugard. Here's Ellen White. You're actually looking at two spirit mediums, both having the same kind of experience on other worlds. Now we're going to, again, Ellen White is just a woman of her time. Now we're going to get to the account of Florence Cook and Robert Owen. Robert Owen was a wealthy man from Tennessee. He wanted to investigate spiritualism. He met Florence Cook, who was a spiritualist. Florence Cook manifested this female she called Katie King, and she manifested him to him many times. Robert Owens became so obsessed and protective of Katie King in seances, it crossed a line. I mean, just reading it crossed a line. Katie King, Florence Cook, was doing a seance. One of the males in the seance, Katie King would manifest physically in the seance. So one of the males in the seance wanted to jump up and kiss Katie King. That didn't set well with Robert Owen. He was jealous. I mean, this man fell in love with, and he truly believed it was a spirit. He fell in love with a spirit. But what's clear to me is Katie Cook, she played Robert Owen like a used violin the whole time. Robert Owen was given Katie Cook financial means to support herself. So now we got a financial relationship here. It's recorded in this book where Florence Cook said to Robert Owen that she was going to offer him a private seance and promise a good time. Really? What do you think that meant? This author, I think, is very clear that things did cross into the sexual realm at one point or another with many of these performative trance women. You know, and what I just said, it's no different than the sensual antics that Ellen White, James White, and others experienced in the Israel Daemon. The hugging, the kissing, the running off into rooms privately, which was absolutely scandalous, which would get you thrown in court like it actually did in the Robert Daemon trial. Like James White ran into a room with an unmarried woman, him himself being unmarried, and they were seen later hugging and kissing, etc. Sensuality. These things breed sensuality at some point in time if they're not stopped soon enough. Now, Ellen White was indeed a woman of her time. Her visions were performative. She came out of a church movement, Methodism, that had displays of excess. Just like Elizabeth O'Kee came out of Edward Irving's church. Excess. No doubt Ellen White knew the power of convincing an audience while she's in performative trance and convincing them, just as Anna Cora Mowat said in 1845. Ellen was from upstate New York, surrounded by spiritualists. You saw all the dots on the map. To me, one of the most remarkable accounts is this Hafed, Prince of Persia account of the other worlds and them obeying the commands of God. See, there's nothing about Ellen White that's unique. Now, I'm not saying that Ellen White copied, by the way. I'm not saying she plagiarized from David Dugard, because I think Ellen White's vision predates his. But what I am saying, though, is that she was doing what all other trance mediums of the time were doing, and that is they were visiting other planets. She's just one amongst many trance mediums. Now, Victorian women, she made a really interesting point in this book that I found fascinating. She said Victorian women that were involved in public speaking communicated a message to the men watching them, and that was they were sexually available. So when a Victorian man saw a Victorian woman by herself speaking publicly, he saw that and said, "You're telling me you're sexually available." And that explains so much about Ellen White and what she did, especially in her early... I think the Israel Damon event forced her to tone down some of what she was doing, because she knew she crossed a line and delved off into excess. Ellen White is simply a product of her time. She is not unique. The book is full of examples of many, many Ellen Whites. I just became aware of another book about trance mediums, Victorian women. It's like, will this ever end? I don't know. So anyway, that book's been ordered, on the way. Maybe another video, maybe not. We'll see. My assessment of Ellen White is this. She is not merely a Victorian woman of trance. She is both a Victorian woman of trance and a product of the burnt over district. I think these two here combined give us the persona of Ellen White. While she used her trance mediumship, not in performative shows where you could go buy tickets necessarily, but she used it and crossed the line over into another realm, which was religion. So she did the same thing, but she took it in a religious realm. By the way, Ellen White, I am not calling her a trance medium, and neither is this author calling her a trance medium. The fact that Ellen White was known as a trance medium, well, predates both of us. I'm going to show you this book right here, History of the Second Advent Message by Isaac Welcome. Look with me here on the screen. Here's the very same book I just held up, dated 1874. This is in the middle of the whole trance medium fiasco. And what does Isaac Welcome say on page 402? He says this, read with me. In the midst of the excitement and strange notions of the time, he was captivated. He is James White. He was captivated by fanaticism, receiving the views of Elder Turner and the visions of Ellen G. Harmon, a native of Portland, and a wonderful fanatic and trance medium. She was already known as a trance medium by those that knew her best and were standing around her in 1874. Actually before 1874, because that's when this book was published. So actually well before that. So this charge of mesmerism, by the way, goes back even further. It goes back to the beginning of Adventism. Look with me here by Joshua Himes, April 21st, 1851, page 69. This is James White again, red text. And in many cases, the cries of mesmerism, fanaticism has been raised. Now, this is a critical comment by James White. The most heaven-daring and fatal example of this was in the calling the gracious work of the Spirit in the Midnight Cry in 1844. Mesmerism, fanaticism, and who said it? Joshua Himes at the Albany Conference in 1845. What did Joshua Himes say? The 7-month movement produced mesmerism 7 feet deep. The 7-month movement, by the way, if you don't know that, that's you, Seventh-day Adventist. All those Millerites who either went back to their churches, asked for forgiveness for the false prophet William Miller, or even those who were just too embarrassed to go back to their churches and refused to go back to a church. But then there's this third group who said, we're so proud, we're not letting 1844 go, and reinvented it, became the Seventh-day Adventists. They were also called the 7th-month movement. That's who Joshua Himes is referring to, Seventh-day Adventists. My best example of Ellen White in performative trance is this. In April 19th of 1845, when she's in her trance state, convincing Joseph Bates that she's a true prophet, she starts counting off planets, the moons of the planets. Here is Ellen White in performance, with an audience, and getting feedback from the audience, because Joseph Bates is, oh, she's talking about Jupiter, oh, she's talking about Saturn. Oh, she hears him. She's performing to an audience. This is the best example of Ellen White, trance performer. Now, those outside Adventism observe the spirit of the time with mesmerism, spirit guides. Ellen White is not unique. She is a trance performer. She visited other planets. She met with the dead, her husband, etc. This claim of visions and trances, and I want to say false ones, is a very old claim in a very old book called the Bible. Read with me here. Jeremiah 14:14. And the Lord said to me, the prophets are prophesying lies in my name. I did not send them, nor did I command them to speak to them. They are prophesying to you a lying vision, worthless divination, and the deceit of their own minds. Elizabeth O'Kee, Anna Cora Mowat, David Dugard, Florence Cook, Ellen White, all fake trance mediums.